So a very warm welcome to this event, which is being presented by the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre in partnership with the British Association for Holocaust Studies. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Centre, which was established in memory of the late British historian, who was, of course, Churchill's official biographer and also published many dozens of books on a huge range of topics pertaining mainly to the 20th century, to the two world wars, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, and the history of the modern Jewish experience. And our aim at the Centre is to bring, as Sir Martin did, the finest historical research to broad, non-academic audiences and to make history as engaging and exciting as possible. I'm particularly excited to announce that this year's Sir Martin Gilbert History Prize is now open for entries. It's a prize that's open to Year 12 students in UK schools, and our aim is to encourage students to engage in historical debate using a range of sources to support their arguments. I'll post a link in the chat once I'm finished the introduction, but please feel free to publicize the prize to any history teachers you know or any promising young people you know who might be interested. I mentioned that the talk tonight is being presented in partnership with the British Association for Holocaust Studies. So before I introduce our wonderful speaker for tonight, I wanted to hand you over very briefly to Jo Pettit, who is representing the British Association for Holocaust Studies, to introduce the organization to you. Jo.
Thank you, Shirley. Just before I say anything else, just to extend my thanks again to Shirley and Bethany and the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, and of course Rebecca Clifford as well. I always think it's really wonderful when two institutions with overlapping interests kind of come together to promote the exchange of ideas. I think it's always a really useful and fruitful exercise. So thank you to all of you for the work you put into the event. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jo Pettit. I am a lecturer in comparative literature at the University of Kent. I am also the secretary of the British Association for Holocaust Studies, which is an organisation that aims to bring together a broad range of people, so academics working across the full field of Holocaust studies in all of its forms, but also teachers, educators, those who work in museums, those with a personal or familial interest in research of the Holocaust. So we're really aiming to open the conversation and to bring people together, and again with this idea of exchanging ideas. That's always at the forefront of what we're trying to do, I think. We tend to organise an annual conference. We also do have a range of activities to support postgraduate students. So we have a mentoring scheme, for example. We have a postgraduate conference that we organise separately. We have postgraduate representatives. So we're really engaged with trying also to support future generations of scholars and those who are working in the field. I will, at the after I finish talking, I'll put the links to our website in the chat. If anyone is interested in joining the association, please do feel free to get in touch with me directly, and I'd be really delighted to hear from you. All right, thank you very much, Shirley, and everyone else.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you to the British Association for Holocaust Studies for partnering with us. It's nice to have you here. So I am really, really delighted and honoured to present our speaker for tonight, who is Rebecca Clifford. Rebecca is Professor of European Transnational History at the University of Durham. This is a new role that she's just taken up, and she's going to be talking to us tonight about her really fabulous recent book, which is titled Survivors: Children's Lives After the Holocaust, and was published by Yale University Press. And I'll put a link in the chat too once I finished my introduction. Where you can find it's just come out in paperback. So please do take a look at that. The book is an exploration of child Holocaust survivors, which Rebecca defines in the book as children aged 10 or younger in 1945. Doubtless she'll tell us more about her scope. And in the book, she thinks about how they made sense of their lives and identities in the aftermath of the Holocaust. It's really fascinating and beautifully written and richly layered. And its significance has been very widely recognized. It was a finalist for several prestigious prizes. It was named a Book of the Year by several newspapers. So we really are in for a treat tonight. Rebecca will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and after that, we'll open up the floor for questions and comments. Feel free if you like to post questions in the chat, but Rebecca's also very keen to have people engage in discussion with her, so you will also be able to unmute yourself and ask questions afterwards. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Rebecca for her talk, which is titled Impossible Reconstructions, Families After the Holocaust. Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And thanks also to Bethany, to Joe, and to the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center for having me. It's a real honor to be with you tonight. I've got a PowerPoint, and so I'm going to share it. Let's see. Can everybody see it okay? Great. I'm going to start with a bit of a story, and if you have read the book, you will know the story because it's on the very first page. It's on the very first page because it was something that a story that really struck me as I was doing the research for the book. And I have to say, I tried a different approach in writing this book, which I think worked pretty well, and I intend to hold on to it for all future books, which is I let myself always be led by what I found really surprising or shocking in my research. Because I realized every time we're shocked as scholars when we find something and it throws us off, it's because it challenges our assumptions. And so I tried to always just hold on to that feeling of surprise when I came across something. So the story I want to start with surprised me very much, but actually the topic that I want to talk about today, this topic of families, it probably shocked me more than anything else I worked on. By the way, can you hear me okay? Do indicate if you can. I realized that it shocked me because it so deeply challenged my assumptions about what a family should look like, about how healthy families were after the war, about whether the reconstruction of families was even always such a good thing. I mean, deeply, deeply challenging. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. So I'm going to start with this little story. In December 1945, a care home for young child survivors of the Holocaust was set up in a country estate, Weir Courtney, in the small town of Lingfield in Surrey. So, I am there. Nope, it's gone right by it. Here it is. It's a picture of the back of this country manor house, which was this care home. The children who spent part of their post-war childhoods in this home came to Britain on a scheme for so-called Children of the Camps that was run by the Central British Fund. To be eligible for the scheme, a child had to be an orphan. Yet it was unclear in December 1945, when these children, you can see some of them here in the photo, arrived, which of these children might indeed have a living parent. In the summer of 1946, the Weir Courtney children were amazed when a father and a mother turned up for the first time to claim one of their fellows, Litzy. So Litzy here is the girl that's kind of second in from the right. So this man and woman came, and they came and they said, well, I'm your father and this is your mother, and they took her home. I'm sorry, a small child is trying to come in the room. I am giving a talk. No, you can't come in. No, sorry, darling, you'll have to leave. I think the message will get through. So Litzy went home with these people, and she believed that they were indeed her parents. And the staff at the care home knew the truth about the situation, but the children did not. Litzy herself believed that she was living with her parents until one day in her late teens. In the midst of an argument, she screamed, "I wish you weren't my father." And the man who had come to claim her all those years before said, "I'm not." So my own children walking through the room right now is a little bit taking the punch out of this story. I apologize, but that one is gone. So I will explain that indeed that man who had come to claim Litzy was in fact her uncle, her father's brother. And if you've encountered the story in the book, you also know that although she was really shocked by this exchange, it also suddenly made a lot of things make sense in her mind. But shortly after Litzy's uncle came to claim her, other parents, all mothers, I think partially by a bit of a coincidence, began to trickle back into the lives of the children of Weir Courtney. The first of these mothers found their children in the autumn of 1946. But the last of these mothers did not make herself known until 1952. Now, Weir Courtney was a small care home. There were never more than 28 children who passed through its doors. I'm in the process of writing a book now specifically about the Weir Courtney care home, because there's a lot of very interesting aspects of that particular very special and unusual orphanage. So of those 28 children, 9 had surviving mothers. Of those 9, 2 returned to live relatively settled lives with their mother. These were twin sisters. 4 spent the rest of their childhoods sort of jostling between living in care and living with their mothers. And 3 never returned to live with their mothers again, or at least not until their childhoods were largely over. I think although this is just one particular care home, this is probably quite a representative experience in some ways. Even if a child survivor of the Holocaust had living parents, it was not necessarily easy, possible, or even ideal for a child to go back to those families. So I start with this little story of one small care home because it illustrates some important points about family reunification after the Holocaust. First of all, the early years after the war's end were an agonizing period of uncertainty for child survivors of the Holocaust, indeed for all survivors of the Holocaust, because they had to brace themselves to learn of the death of their parents, but equally had to hold out hope that they might be alive. Think of this girl whose mother showed up in 1952, and she'd been hanging in this, liminal state for all those years. Secondly, as I think I've just said, the long wait was strung over a period of years. So it's a kind of conflicted state that had to be sort of drawn out through much of the remainder of their childhoods. Thirdly, when surviving parents did turn up, those reunions were very rarely easy ones. And this, I think, is very difficult to accept in some ways. And this is what I want to talk about today. Our assumptions intercede when we think about family reunions after the war. We've all encountered that kind of cathartic scene in film and literature when families are reunited after the Holocaust. It's difficult to set this aside and focus on a more complex and emotionally fraught picture. We are, I think, seduced by the presumption that family, sorry, I can see my face is like, everything's going funny. This is what happens when you do a talk in your home with your children literally screaming outside the door and the beautiful setting sun of the Northeast shining right in your eye. The cat is also asleep on the bed, and that could go disastrously wrong at any minute now, but we forge ahead. I've lost my place and all that. Yes, right, that presumption that family reunions necessarily marked a positive outcome for survivor children, especially, of course, when so many children who survived the Holocaust had no one to reclaim them at the end of the war. I think this was my assumption, that it must necessarily be the best possible outcome. You find your mother, she's alive. You find your father, he's alive, and you get to go back to them, and all these other children don't. And surely that makes you the lucky one. So how shocking was it for me then to encounter some of the stories that I'm going to tell you about, 2 stories tonight, and also to encounter the opposite. So many child survivors in the research for the book, because there's 100 children in the book, obviously now in their 80s, who were so grateful that they spent the rest of their childhoods in orphanages. So I think for me, that was a very hard assumption to let go of. So as Shirley has said, the research that I'm telling you about today comes from my latest book. That's just a picture of the cover. This is a book that looks at the post-war lives of 100 very young child survivors. It doesn't mean that I don't think that older children weren't survivors, but there was a good reason why I focused on the very young. So all the children in the book were born between 1935 and 1944. The reason for that, it's a little bit of a sidetrack because it's not directly relevant to the talk today, but I will just explain it to you. It's actually, it has to do with memory, because I think of myself as, certainly by training, I'm a historian of memory, and I'm an oral historian. And what actually drove me to do this project was I've been working on a very, very different project sort of years ago now, actually, as a postdoctoral student. But it was a project that meant that I had to go out and do a lot of oral history interviews. And I started to get into the rhythm of doing these interviews and thinking about sort of the pattern of a life story, you know, how we tell our stories. The truth is we follow a pattern for the most part when we tell our life stories. If I come and interview you, I will probably start by asking you, well, tell me your name and tell me where you're from and your date of birth. And you'll probably start by telling me about the town you were born, or maybe the time, or you'll tell me about your parents. We ground our stories, we root them in you know, that origin world of our original families and our maybe our hometowns. And while I was doing that project, which was not about the Holocaust at all, I started to think, you know, what happens if you don't know that basic information? What if you can't tell the story of who your parents were or your hometown because you didn't know them and you've never been to your hometown, and that part of your early years is entirely lost to you? How do you make sense of your life? How do you tell the story of who you are? That was actually the impetus that led me to write the book. So that's why it's only very young children in the book. Because of course they have, the youngest children really have no pre-war memories. And so these are children who survived, they're in continental Europe, they survived the Holocaust in person, as it were, but they don't often remember it, or they only remember it in a fragmentary way. So unsurprisingly, there was a lot of emotive topics in the book. And in a book full of emotive topics, probably there was nothing I found quite as emotional as the issue of families. The truth is that family reunions could be among the most difficult and distressing experiences that children went through after the war. And if we look at the situation with neutral eyes, it's really not hard to see why. The reunified post-war Jewish family was intensely fragile. Parents and children had often been apart for years, and the war had changed them. Of course it had. They frequently had no common language anymore. Children might have new names, new religions, new national identities, strong attachments to wartime host families. The youngest children might have had no memory at all of their parents, and so effectively they were returned to strangers. And parents were changed too. They had been living in concentration camps, in forced and slave labor situations, in hiding, or living a dangerous existence trying to pass as Aryan. Many were in a state of physical and emotional exhaustion by the liberation. They faced staggering poverty and ungenerous restitution policies after the war. This could mean that children were returned to families that had no housing, had no clothing, had lacked access to food. Economic instability and emotional fragility combined in many families to ensure that reunions were fraught and even disastrous. So today I want to talk about that process of family reunification after the Holocaust, looking a little bit at how aid agencies and parents and children approach the issue. We'll also talk through a couple of case studies, exploring these stories through archival documents and oral history. My chief goal is to probe at that gulf between the reconstructed Jewish family as an ideological symbol and the reality of a fractured social unit, and to focus on how it felt to be a child in all of this. So, to tell you a little bit about the scale of the problem, an estimated 150,000 Jewish children survived the Holocaust in continental Europe, with an additional 30,000 surviving by fleeing into the Soviet Union, and some additional tens of thousands surviving through kinder transport schemes, not only to Britain, although Britain's was the biggest one, but also to the United States, to France, and a few smaller schemes. This is of an estimated 1.5 million pre-war Jewish children. So it is a fraction of the population that survives. In the early post-war years, 120,000 of these children, so the vast majority, received financial support from aid agencies such as the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And of these, a sizable majority, of 85,000 lived with at least one surviving parent or with relatives. So this kind of just gives you a sense that it was not an uncommon experience to be returned to your parents or a parent, or at least to relatives. So it wasn't a negligible number of families affected. It's also important to keep the bigger picture in mind. There were an estimated 13 million children across Europe, Jewish and non-Jewish, who lost at least one parent during the war. So when we think of Jewish children, child survivors in this context, it's a much kind of bigger issue of a whole generation of European children who have lost their parents or who are in the kind of this precarious family situation after the war. These surviving children found themselves part of a massive effort involving care agencies, states, the United Nations, and other institutions to reconstruct Europe's families and Europe's Jewish families after the Holocaust. These efforts were driven by practical concerns, but they were also driven by ideological ones. The power of an emerging post-war vision of the family as a bulwark against the return of fascism, as the base unit for a renewed democracy. This has been well studied by historians, as I'm sure you know. You'll all be familiar, for example, with the concept of the baby boom in this period, the expansion of the European welfare states, the promotion of the so-called nuclear family in this nuclear age. So this was common to some degree transnationally in the west of Europe, obviously not in Eastern Europe. States and new humanitarian aid organizations shared in this vision of the family as a unit that could act against the collectivist impulses in fascism, of course, in communism as well. This post-war embrace of the family was, as so often is the case, was kind of laced with fears of the opposite, that in fact the war had destroyed families and that European civilization could not be rebuilt until families were rebuilt. This is something that historian Tara Zara writes about so wonderfully. And she writes that there was a powerful shared post-war perception that if Nazism has sought to destroy the family, then its restoration would be Europe's salvation. So the post-war reconstruction of families was kind of bound together with the reconstruction process in a broader sense. Tara Zara also reminds us that this wasn't just a return to a sort of pre-war normality. This was a moment in which the basic ideals of family and childhood were being reinvented. There was an emerging new world of experts, such as social workers using the casework model, and psychologists and youth workers. These people were working at the coalface of this intersection between mental health, the family, and citizenship. This process was also strongly informed by new developments in psychoanalysis, and particularly the growth of child psychoanalysis. And that's actually what my next book is about, because if I go back in space and show you We're Courtney again, the person who set this orphanage up and was effectively its patron was Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud. So very, very strong links between this little group of children and the developing field of child psychoanalysis. The work of Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham, who was her collaborator, on evacuated children in Britain was well known to a general public, as was their rather novel then at the time assertion that for a child, separation from the family was more harmful than the risk of falling bombs. John Bowlby, whose work was likely well known to a general public in Britain, argued even more forcefully that maternal deprivation would turn children into, in his language, affectionless characters doomed to crippled emotional relationships.
So there was a strong push driven by these changes in social work and in psychoanalysis, and reinforced by institutions and aid agencies towards the reconstruction of families as a central part of post-war reconstruction more broadly. But the gulf between this ideological vision of the family and the on-the-ground reality of family reunification was huge. The care agencies whose work it was to reunite families walked a difficult and sometimes contradictory line between subscribing to that ideal, putting family reunification first, and worrying about its repercussions. Agency care workers themselves were, of course, not operating in isolation, and their actions were informed by certain prejudice, a quite widespread prejudice towards survivors, especially concentration camp survivors. In the immediate post-war popular imagination, adult residents of displaced person camps and concentration camp survivors were seen as relying on charity handouts, running the black market. And there was a widespread perception just of a moral corruption from having gone through the concentration camp experience. In Britain, newspaper articles and letters to the editor opined that survivors would be violent, would be incapable of unlearning the skills of deception that were presumed to have helped them survive in the camps. Social workers from aid organizations such as the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee or the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration worried that camp survivor parents would not be up to the task of rebuilding families. They were particularly critical about survivor mothers, thinking that they had lost their feminine qualities. It is difficult, I think, from a 21st century vantage point, when we honor Holocaust survivors, to recognize how deeply survivors were the objects of fear and suspicion in those early post-war years. This was true for both adult and child survivors, but children were generally seen to be more redeemable in the language that was often used at the time. Indeed, some child advocates went so far as to argue that children were better off not being returned to survivor parents, and their parents should resist reclaiming them. There was a presumption there that children would recover from concentration camp experiences, but adults would not. There were also practical issues that negatively influenced family reunification. The attitude that children would have a more secure material life if they were not forced to return to impoverished parents was shared not only by care workers, but by many parents and sometimes even by children themselves. Indeed, because survivor parents were often expected to resume financial obligations to their children if they were reunited, both parents and children sometimes sought to conceal the fact that parents had survived from aid agencies. As well, because many post-war immigration schemes were open only to children, parents and children sometimes worked to hide their survival so that the children could get out of Europe. For example, Canadian aid agencies recorded in the early post-war period that some children who had immigrated on their Jewish war orphan scheme, and I write about it in the book quite a bit, partly because it can be quite hard to access the files of these particular schemes, these aid agencies. There's always quite a lot of personal information in those files, and many of those people are still alive or their own children are still alive. So for many of the aid agencies I write about in the book, their files are closed, the case files for the children, but the Canadian ones were open. So I did quite a lot of research in the Canadian archives, which was really very eye-opening. So their scheme was again only for war orphans. You had to be a full orphan to participate in the scheme. So it will probably not surprise anyone in the room to hear that many children hid the fact that their parents had survived, so they could get out of the DP, the displaced person camps, and move on to Canada. And often they actually sort of schemed with their surviving parent, okay, I'll get there first and then you'll follow by this other route. And in some cases that is exactly what happened. And after a while, the Canadian Jewish Congress who ran the scheme cottoned on to what was going on, but they couldn't really do anything about it. So it was indeed the case that some children who came to Canada or went to Canada on the scheme did end up having their parents then later join them. I think cases like that actually remind us that children had at least some agency in this process. You know, obviously their parents were also involved, but there's certainly in looking at the case files, you can see how far the children kind of worked around and through these lies effectively, worked with them sometimes for years, held up this concealment. But children's agency is by far the most difficult force to chart in this drama of family reunification, if you only look at archival documents. With that in mind, I would like now to briefly turn to a couple of stories. One family where the daughter was reunited with her parents, and one where the parent and child never managed to resume their family life. You can tell those stories through archival documents up to a point. But to understand the afterlives of these attempts at family reconstruction, I will always also use, always, that's a bit of a Freudian slip, I will always use oral history. I will also use oral history. And indeed, my approach in the book was that I always started from the archival documents and then tried to work out from there to find people, to interview them about their experiences, to compare what the archive record and the oral history record said. And it threw up a lot of interesting things. So the first case I want to talk about briefly is that of Joan. Joan, you can see she's the child on the right, and also she's the very smallest child in the group picture, standing in the front. She was born Fanny Zed in Brussels in February 1940. Her father was taken when the Germans invaded Belgium in May, but he managed to escape and survive the war, first in hiding in Vichy, France, and then remarkably managed to make it to Britain in 1943, where he actually joined the forces. Quite an unusual story in this sense. Joan's mother managed to escape across the Pyrenees with Joan and with her older half-sister. So already, you know, this far in the story, two remarkably brave parents and a very unusual story in some ways. When they got across the Pyrenees, the American Friends Service Committee, working together with the United States Commission on the Care of European Children, brought the two children, but not their mother, by ship to the United States in the spring of 1943. So again, it's a kind of kinder transport scheme to the United States. After a brief stay in an orphanage, Joan was placed with a well-off foster family in Philadelphia. She was 3 years old. So that's how old she is if you're looking in these pictures. After 4 years with her foster family in Philadelphia, Joan and her sister were sent back to live with their parents in 1947. So she was 3 when she left, 7.5 when she returned. Her parents were trying to reestablish their lives in London at this point. Now, if we look at the archival documents around Joan's case, here from the American Friends Service Committee files, they give a rather rosy picture of this family reunion, largely based on positive, but quite judgmental and positive judgmental assessments of both the foster and the birth families in this case. So the agency interviewed Joan's birth mother in August 1944. And she noted, it noted the following in her case file. She makes an excellent impression. Although obviously very much moved by the news of her children, she was restrained and intelligent in speaking of them. So obviously the right kind of mother. And then the notes were equally praiseworthy of Joan's foster family. In the notes it said, "This little girl walked into the arms of her foster parents and has a very secure place in their affections. The foster parents are middle-class people living in a suburban community and have a fine standard of living." The case notes record that the news in 1947 that she would be returned to her birth parents was quite upsetting for Joan, but she calmed down somewhat after the initial shock. From the agency's perspective, there was no reason to believe that this wouldn't be a fairly smooth reunification. Joan had been in a loving home She was returning to a loving birth mother, and in many ways, the situation seemed to fit the ideal. But Joan's testimony gives a rather less rosy picture of the process of family reunification, one in which she recalls being caught in a very tangled web between her foster family and her birth family, which was a quite common trajectory for many child survivors. She recalled when I interviewed her in 2014 that she didn't really understand that her foster parents weren't her real parents. She was taken by plane to England, where she recalled her mother. She had no common language anymore with her mother. Her parents were trying to learn English. Her father spoke English, but her mother didn't yet. She remembers her mother trying to hug her and thinking, I just didn't want them to touch me. I'm quoting from her. It was a nightmare. You know, it was like being abducted. Part of what was destabilizing for Joan was this sudden shift in social class as well, although she couldn't have articulated it that way at the time. She'd lived with quite a wealthy family in Philadelphia in this big home with a spacious lawn and a maid. But her birth parents, although they had been well off before the war, they were just trying to scrape it back together again. They were living in a small flat above a shop with a cold water sink and an outdoor toilet in what she calls a slum somewhere near King's Cross Station. It was her parents' embarrassment about their situation more than the actual poverty that made her uncomfortable. She remembers that although her father seemed to understand that she herself had gone through some very challenging experiences during the war, her mother, quote, only saw that I was her baby and I had gone away and now I was back, and why didn't I just love her? So part of the agony in trying to rebuild was her mother's lack of understanding that Joan's own trajectory during the Holocaust had changed her. So while Joan was reunited with her family, it wasn't comfortable. And she ended up going back and forth between her birth parents and her foster parents throughout the remainder of her childhood. No matter where she was, she felt as if the other household was always being negatively judged. In her words, as an adult trying to make sense of the experience, she recalls that I was sort of being told who I am is no good. The difficulties she experienced returning to her family were really quite common to those who were returned to live with birth parents after the war. And her case reminds us that where there were multiple claims on a child during the war period, this could then stretch into the post-war years with quite damaging consequences. The confusion and guilt caused by two different families claiming her made this a difficult reunion, even if it was a successful reunion in the eyes of the aid agencies. And this is certainly, if there is anybody in the room tonight who is a child survivor, and I hope that there is, I really love speaking with survivors and speaking to survivor audiences, but certainly child survivors who were in hiding during the war will probably recognize elements of this very common experience of loving the family who hid you, and also loving your birth family, and that the conflict often being very stressful for children going forwards. So that was a brief look at Joan's story, and I want to again briefly just look at the story of Vic Vixie. Vic is the little boy on the right here. He was born in April 1941 in Berlin. This is actually, he also was a child who was at the Weir Courtney care home, the picture I showed you at the beginning. And this is actually a picture from the Daily Mail, the Daily, I'm trying to remember which newspaper it's from a British daily paper, about 1945, 1946. Because these children actually also kind of got quite a lot of media attention. That's another story. So this is Vic. He was born 1941 in Berlin. So at the war's end, he was only 4 years old. His father was taken away 2 weeks after his birth, and his mother was working as a slave laborer in a rubber factory in Berlin, near Berlin. He was put in the Berlin Jewish hospital with an ear infection when he was about a year old, and he was actually deported from the Jewish hospital, and his mother didn't know what had happened to him. He was deported to Theresienstadt ghetto camp. He survived the camp thanks to the attention and sacrifice of the adults who worked in the camp's children's wards. And after the war, he was one of this cohort of 300 children who were sent from Theresienstadt to England. And then the youngest ones of those eventually came to live in Weir Courtney. Sorry, something went ding. It was probably my email, just ignore it. So staff at Weir Courtney learned in 1946 that Vic's mother was still alive and she was living in Austria. But although some attempts at reunion were made, Vic did not actually see his mother again until he was in his late teens. The archives of the Joint Jewish Distribution Committee contain a number of documents on Vic's case, which are quite interesting. And they offer suggestions as to why reunion proved challenging for this family. The files show that Vic's mother, Margot, was working as an interpreter for the American troops in Austria after the war. And she was boarding in a hotel for single women who were working with forces. They also show that Vic's grandmother, so this is his mother's mother, had survived but was living in Sweden. And she herself was struggling financially to the extent that her correspondence shows, she writes, I could not even provide my own daughter with living accommodation or any funds. So this is a family that was really split up, separated across the generations, and really struggling financially. It's also worth noting that Margot, Vic's mother, had 2 additional children with a different father. And these children were boarded out with a foster family. And the staff at Weir Courtney really looked askance at this. In the fall of 1946, Margot, the mother, Vic's mother, wrote to the Austrian Red Cross looking for Vic. When she located him in England, she wrote a letter to the British Jewish Refugee Committee explaining, quote, sorry, I need to take a drink. It's that time in the talk when you become dehydrated. I couldn't write to you before, she wrote, because I didn't have plans for our future. But then she said, I'm ready now to receive Vic, and could you please send him to Berlin? But the agencies involved were suspicious that if they did send Vic to reunite with his mother, she would end up placing him in foster care, because of course she had these 2 other half-siblings of Vic who were in foster care. A few months later, Vic's mother's mother, Vic's grandmother, wrote to the Joint suggesting that actually it would not be a good idea to return Vic to Germany. I've written Germany, but I think I meant Austria, and asking that he actually be sent instead to a niece in Palestine who would be willing to take better care of him. So there's some doubts in the family about what should happen with this boy. The archives also show that in June 1947, official permission was given to repatriate Vic to Austria. He wasn't from Austria, but to reunite with his mother, but the permission closed without him having ever been sent. If we turn to the archival holdings on the orphanage itself, and there are many records from this particular orphanage located in quite a big handful of archives across the world. It's part of the reason I'm able to write about it for the book that I'm working on now, is because there's so many archival holdings on this orphanage. We can find rather a different perspective on the problem. Staff at the care home clearly felt it was their duty to protect Vic from his mother. They were suspicious of her motivations, and they were suspicious of her character. In March 1952, Vic was 11 years old, and the matron of Weir Courtney, Alice Goldberger, wrote rather piercingly in the records of the orphanage the following. It's quite a long quote. I will read it to you though. Vic has got a mother who is in Austria. We heard last of her that she's a waitress. She has several children from different men. This was not actually true, but she did have more children. Very unfortunately for Vic, she wrote to him and promised to take him, and we started to teach him German, which he had forgotten, because we expected the call for him to go home. He was very bewildered at that time, talking about his little sister and his mummy in Austria or Australia, because of course he had no memory of her. One day, a new uncle wrote to Vic, promising to take him and his mummy to America. I kept this letter away from him. I didn't want to upset the child and bring new conflicts to him. It looks as if his mother has met a young American soldier with whom she has made all kinds of future plans. And this is the last we heard directly from her. If we turn to oral history, it further complicates the story because we're quite privileged, very unusually in Vic's case, to have testimony from his mother, recorded by psychologist Sarah Moskovitz in 1978. In this interview, Margot recalled that in the immediate post-war years, her circumstances made it impossible to keep a child with her. So this is from her interview. She said, "For a while I thought to take him, and I wrote to Miss Goldberger about it, but what would I do with him? He didn't speak German. I was still ducked under." She was still passing as Aryan, even though it was after the war. I decided I couldn't take him. I had nothing, absolutely nothing. I had the 2 children boarded out. I was living in a hotel with the other girls. It was no place to take a child. The people who had the other 2 children couldn't take another child. I wrote to Miss Goldberger and I asked her if she could keep him. Things didn't get any better with me, living from hand to mouth. I was very torn. Here's a child who's being taken away by force, and all of a sudden I can't take him back. But the life he had there was better than the life I could give him in Austria. This explanation corresponds to what some of the archival documents set out, but other details in Margot's narrative suggest a further layer of complexity. She relates that she did remarry and she immigrated to the United States in the early 1950s, around the time that the care home notes were referring to this new uncle. She established a new life there, but she still didn't ask Vic to join her. She did, however, refuse to agree to a potential adoption that the care home tried to arrange when Vic was 12 years old. So she felt unable to care for Vic, but equally, she wanted to continue to claim him for the family. This, too, is quite a common trajectory for child survivors, many of whom discovered their families did not want to give them up, did not want to see their names changed, but at the same time lacked either the financial or the emotional capacity to actually care for them. Vic's own explanation is again somewhat different. I interviewed him in July 2017, and he recalled this terrible tension between these frequent promises that he would get to go live with his mother and the constant disappointment when it didn't happen. If Vic's mother's story seeks to justify, Vic's own story reflects the confusion of a now grown child who still doesn't understand really what happened. He recalled, this is from his interview with me, "In 1947, I heard that my mother was still alive and living in Germany or Austria, one of those. Nothing ever really came of it. It was kind of under the rug. But then in the early 50s, it rose up again. I was all excited. I was going to go to Germany and be with her. And I started trying to learn German again because I had forgotten what I had very quickly. Then that fell apart. Nothing came of that. Then in May 1958, I got a letter from my mother. She was in the United States. I had a brother and sister. She was married to a man who had a steady job, and she was telling me to come, and I wanted to go." He remembered that he had fond dreams about what it would like to be reunited with his mother, but the actual reunion was disorienting and strange. His mother lived with her 2 younger children and a third husband in quite a remote town in the Washington State mountains, in the middle of Washington State, quite far from any bigger community. Vic says, "It didn't take long to realize I might not have done the wrong thing." So he went to live with them, basically. And so he's speaking about that experience. "It was not what I thought it would be like. It was not at all not all peaches and cream. I had visited school friends who had regular families, so I thought I knew what it should be like. But when I got there, nobody really said anything to me. It felt strange. My mother wasn't kind. There were times when I wondered what I was doing there. It wasn't until years later that I found out from my sister that she and my brother were hoping that I would get them out of there. They only lived together for a few months, and Vic finally fled that family home and ended up joining the army in the United States. In conclusion then, from these brief stories, I think these stories suggest that rebuilding a relationship with a survivor parent could be a real minefield for children who were survivors themselves. For all the parties involved, aid agencies, parents, and children, the dream of the ideal family loomed large, but the reality was often material and emotional insecurity. Joan and Vic's stories represent trajectories that many child survivors will recognize. They serve as examples of why families face such enormous challenges when they manage to reunite. I also hope that you see that the stories flag up the potential that comes from combining archival sources with later oral history. The archival holdings of aid agencies can show us some of the early mechanics of family reunion. And they can suggest some of the complexities of the process, even if you're kind of left guessing about individual motivations. Oral history gives us a different perspective, also not a perfect one. It is, of course, not the child's perspective, but the adult's perspective on childhood experience. It doesn't allow us to directly access a child's thoughts or emotions. But what it does shed light on are the long-term consequences of post-war family rebuilding, highlighting the impacts of broken parent-child relationships over the course not only of childhood, but over entire lives. In studying family reunions after the Holocaust, we come face to face with the bald reality of what the European Jewish family looked like as a social unit in the wake of genocide. It's a jarring picture of the long reach of destruction into the most intimate of spheres, the home and its inhabitants. And I'll end on that rather pessimistic note, but I really very much look forward to having your questions. I'll stop the shared screen now too.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for such an engaging and such a sensitive talk. I think it's just those two case studies give a bit of a glimpse into some of the really multi-layered and rich stories that you draw out in your book. And it's really so striking and significant, the project that you set yourself to use multiple sources from the archival sources and then the oral histories to be able to trace how the children's perceptions change across time. So that's really striking and came out beautifully in the talk too.
I hope it was not made less sensitive by, could you hear my children going insane outside the door? I hope
Not really. Not really.
That was a new career moment. They were having a little sing-along outside the door.
Happens to the best of us.
Glad you could not hear that.
No, it was all good. And we now have a bit of time. So it's 4 minutes to 8 in the UK. And we've advertised this as finishing at 8, but I'll leave the room open till about 10 past 8 if people want to ask questions. No, you did not. That's all good. I talked too long at the beginning. So we have time for your questions and comments if people would like to ask them. And I invite you to, I can see if a few people have sent me some direct message questions, or if people want to just put their hands up, and then I'll be able to ask you to speak. So I will start off with Gladwin's question, which she sent to me directly. And she asks, Rebecca, did you find any of the 100 children whose reunions could be regarded as normal in the survivor context?
That's a great question, because the short answer is no, not among the 100 I looked at. But since that time, many times when I've been giving talks, people have put their hand up at the end and said, well, actually, my family we didn't really have these issues. So it doesn't mean that every family reunion was as fraught as the ones I've described. However, I was just really struck when there's 100 children in the book. 100 is not a small number. And there wasn't one I'm sorry, this sentence came out funny. Every single one of the children in the book who was returned to a family member, whether a surviving mother, father, or aunt and uncle, maybe in one case there was a grandmother, every single one of those reunifications was very difficult. Whereas there's also probably about, I'm thinking I should know this off the top of my head. I think it's about 35% were returned to a surviving parent of the 100 in the book, and the rest spent the rest of their childhoods in care homes. The care home children generally had a much more positive experience. That's, I think, it was coming around to accepting that. It was actually quite challenging for me. It does not mean, however, that in general that's necessarily true for child survivors, but this is what the sort of, I don't think the 100 in the book are, a representative sample. That's not possible with this kind of history, but it represents a wide swath of the experience.
Let me just ask one more question from the chat, and then I'll bring Antonia in, who's put her hand up. John asks, well, he posed this question when you were talking much earlier about the Weir Courtney care home. And he asked the question about how the 1952 mother found her child, but maybe you could talk more broadly about, we know how difficult tracing was at that time. Maybe you can say just a little bit about the process of finding one another or not.
Yes, so that mother eventually found her child the way that most parents and children were reunited, through the Red Cross's International Tracing Service. I can't remember off the top of my head why it took so many years. There was a lot of crossed signals because this was a very, very imperfect process. You had this sort of central body trying to collect all the information, and there was quite a number of strange anomalies that turned up among the 100 children in the book. There's I think I talk about it in at the beginning of one of the chapters, chapter 4 maybe, of this family, where the children are told, oh, your mother has been found, and then she just disappears again and no one ever sees her and no one knows if it was even real. And so this is because of simply the nature of this enormous amount of communication going through the tracing service of the Red Cross. Some of it's wrong, some of it's misplaced. Sometimes they try to get back to the person and they've moved and there's no forwarding address. So this is what happens in the case of the mother who turns up in 1952, is somehow just a lot of mixed up communication, and eventually she finds out that her daughter is in Britain, but it takes that many years. And she does then, that particular child does eventually go back to live with her mother as well. But by that point, she's a teenager. So many years have passed.
Thank you. Antonia, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, hello.
Hi, Antonia.
Hi. Just to, I sort of wanted to ask this as a question, but I think that honestly, I wanted to just make an observation and ask you to comment on that. And it's that really until recently, I've never questioned the thinking behind providing sanctuary for orphan children ahead of families. But particularly in the light of both the Afghan and Ukrainian crisis at the moment, I'm beginning to question that position that I've held. And I wondered whether you have any comments on whether perhaps preserving family units is perhaps more important than prioritizing orphan children, however tragic their situation might be.
I have opinions about this, I think, but they are mostly based on my understanding of what happened in so many cases in the past, that it was not just Britain and not just Canada, but every country involved in taking child Holocaust survivors after 1945 that shut the door on parents. And it is, from our vantage point now, we can see just how cruel and totally unnecessary such a policy was. We could have taken those parents. We're not talking about enormous numbers, but very deliberately in the British case, the Home Office said no. Very deliberately, in the Canadian case, the federal government said no. And that happened in other countries as well. And I think we should deeply question any policy that sees it okay as somehow okay to take children and not their parents. But that's not really what you were asking. You're asking about orphans versus families. Of course, my short answer is let's take both. But I think if we have some leverage with policymakers, it's very good to remind them that we were wrong not to take families in the past, and I would love to see us take families in the present. But for lots of reasons, I think governments often deem it much easier to take children than their families. There is a certain fear that adults will take jobs. It was a fear in 1945-46. It's a fear now that children will be more easily assimilable, that they will become, gosh, you saw it quite a lot when I was going through the Canadian archives, this presumption that if we take the children, they'll become Canadians, but their parents won't, which is, of course, a ridiculous assumption, but it was there all the time. It permeates all the documents. And I'm sure that way of thinking is still around today. But I know how much work you do with refugee children, Antonia, and yeah, of course, I just to have even just to remind those who are able to make these sort of decisions that we made a terrible mistake when we did not take the parents of kinder transport children, for example. We could have taken those parents, and we could have spared those children a lifetime without their parents. I think about that a lot, but I know that I didn't answer your question. That's me having a rant about it because I feel very emotionally strongly about this. I feel we made a terrible mistake, and in all our celebration, we do a lot of celebrating the kinder transport. I wish we'd say more about that, actually. We could have taken those parents too.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions. I have a question too. I'll see if I can slip it in, but I may not be able to because I'm going to have to give preference to those on the floor. So Bethany first and then Nick, go ahead.
Thank you. I have read your book and I loved it. As I said, I'd very much recommend it. And one of the things that really struck me was when you talked about how children who had been very happy in the war and post-war years with their foster families being forcibly removed by, and in some cases really sounding like a kidnapping at the side of a road. I think it was Paulette that stuck in my mind. I just wondered if there was ever any acknowledgement in the years later from the kidnappers, I'll call them, the agencies that were reuniting these children forcibly, that they had not necessarily done the best thing for those children who were quite traumatized by that.
No. That was easy.
Okay.
Not that I have ever come across. And actually what's interesting, and I've only really just thought of it now because of the way you phrased your question, it's very interesting to think about how the children themselves rationalize this. So the kidnappings, so what Bethany is talking about is I read about a girl, Paulette, who remembers, she actually writes in her memoir that she's, this is in post-war France, she's been hidden with a French family during the war, and she has a memory that she's walking down the road with her French rescue mother, who she thinks of by this point as her real mother. Her real mother has been murdered. She's walking down the road with her French mother, and this car pulls up and says, you know, this men jump out and grab her. She's just a little girl, and they say something like, "Don't worry, we're Jewish, and we're taking you to a place where you can be Jewish too." And they pull her away screaming, and she's like, "No, don't take me away!" And the mother is also screaming. And when I first read that story, I thought, surely this is not actually what happened. Surely that's just how her child's mind has remembered this. It must have felt so traumatic that it was like a kidnapping. I actually couldn't believe it. And I mentioned it to another researcher who was at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We were doing research in the reading room, and she said, "Oh no, there's lots of documents showing these kidnappings did happen." So sure enough, we sort of worked through some together. And yes, there's documentary evidence in the archives that children were effectively kidnapped in exactly that way. I have never come across anything from the
aid agencies. In that particular case, it's an agency called the OSE, operating in France, ever any sense of any regret that might have been damaging. But what you do come across in a lot of the oral history with children is their rationalizing of the event. So children will often say, years after the fact, obviously, they had to do that. They had to do that because I had to relearn how to be Jewish. I was living with a Christian family, or I had to, had to be brought back. I had to be brought back to my people. That is how the children themselves often explain the action. But it is a rationalization. It does not, it's a way of dealing with the complete trauma of the experience of being ripped away from the only family that you've ever known. Paulette's was quite an extreme story, but there are others in the book who were forcibly removed from their wartime rescue families, and with similar reaction. Although I have to say, I don't want to give the impression that all children had a wonderful experience with their wartime host families. Some had actually quite terrible experiences with those who sheltered them during the war too.
Thank you. Nick, go ahead.
I'd be interested for your views on the nature of the distress that the children suffered. I mean, obviously they were upset, but I imagine if you look at the 100 that you studied, a proportion became, if you like, mentally unwell. I'd be interested for your views as to what proportion became mentally unwell and how you would characterize the nature of their mental illness.
Okay, so I write about that quite a lot in the book.
Okay.
Of the 100 who are in the story, I would characterize none of them as mentally unwell. But let me explain what I mean. So first of all, they are not a representative sample in the sense that they all wanted to either tell me their story directly or tell someone their story, and I used somebody else's recording of an interview. So these are all adults, then children, who felt able to tell their story. So already it's quite a very specific sample of people. They are also people, I think, who largely have at times in their lives struggled with anxiety, struggled with deep feelings of uncertainty, have questioned whether they were well, but none in the sample of 100 have been clinically or in a pathological way have had mental health issues. What I find interesting in all this is less the question of, are these children damaged, and more the question of, why do we ask if they're damaged, if that makes sense? Because in the 1970s and 80s, there was quite a lot of psychologists who were interested in child survivors with exactly this question in mind. The presumption was that, okay, well, we know that children from, who've had traumatic childhoods often go on to have all sorts of problems. So if we turn to child survivors as a group, will we find all kinds of mental health issues? So there was quite an enormous amount of what I would call oral history, although it wasn't called that, done with child survivors in the late 1970s and early 1980s to exactly this end. And I have a chapter in the book about it because I think, for all the fact that it was done, there's a lot of goodwill behind the project and a desire to help. A lot of the child survivors who were interviewed quite resented the attempt to pathologize their experience. So sort of pushed back against it, saying things like, well, yes, of course, I'm anxious sometimes, I'm worried, but I don't think there's anything wrong with me. And I think they were right. They were working through their experiences. Yes, they did have challenges that they faced, but this isn't as a group, there aren't people who ended up fighting in a kind of, battling against clinical mental health issues through the rest of their adult lives. So I am on the side of sort of wanting to push back against the pathologization of their experiences. I think, yes, in many ways they struggled just as many of us do struggle, but I would not characterize their experience in any particular way in that sense. Actually, it's an interesting question though, because about a week ago, I did a wonderful event. I think it was one of my favorite events I've ever done. I spoke to a group of child survivors at a group in Toronto, basically. And it was just a kind of open discussion. I did a couple of readings from the book, and then we just chatted. But they actually really wanted to probe me on the question of, it was very painful to talk about. One of them just said point blank, did we hurt our children? Have we hurt our children because of our experiences? And a lot of them shared their fears that somehow they had damaged their own children. And I answered as that my mother is a child survivor. So, I'm a child of a child survivor, and I can speak very intimately about that experience. And I can tell you all about, the wonderful and positive things that I've gotten from my mother. And I can also tell you she has battled with anxiety in a non-clinical way, but nonetheless, she can be quite anxious. So I think on the part of child survivors themselves, they can worry that there are mental health issues. I think the worry is probably more than the actual impact of really damaging issues. They didn't come up that much. So that was a very long-winded answer. What I'm saying is I try to resist pathologization. But of course there are some issues.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I can see, Nanette, you have your hand up, and I've also received a few more questions in the chat, but it is almost 8:15 here in the UK. So I'm afraid don't apologize. It's been wonderful to have your talk and your answers, Rebecca, but I am going to draw it to a close. And just to thank you so much again, Rebecca, on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre and the British Association for Holocaust Studies, for taking the time to share your amazing book and these wonderful stories with us. A reminder to all of you that you can buy the book now in paperback on Yale University's Press's website. And you've had some strong recommendations in the chat from fellow audience members. So please do take a moment to look at that, and we highly encourage you to go and buy it. If I can also give a little plug for the centre, as a charity, we rely on donations so that we can keep all our events free at the point of access and reach a wide audience. So any contributions from you are very gratefully received. It's very easy to donate on our website. And finally, just to remind you about our next talk, which is on Monday, the 9th of May. Bethany's already popped a link in the chat. We have Professor Jeremy Crang from the University of Edinburgh, who's coming to talk to us about women in the British Armed Forces during World War II. So please do register to book your place. Hopefully we'll see many of you there. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks again, Rebecca, and hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.